Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into an analysis that looks at Donald Trump's actions in a totally different way. Not as random chaos, but as a deliberate strategy, a playbook for getting and holding on to power that's as old as history itself. So let's just dive right in with the big question that our source material really puts on the table. It gets right to the heart of it all. What actually happens when a leader starts to operate as if the normal rules just don't apply to them anymore? You see, the whole idea here is that if you really want to understand Donald Trump's actions, you have to look past the daily headlines and all the noise. The analysis suggests there's a pattern, a kind of script being followed, one that's been pulled from the long and, let's be honest, often brutal history of how power really works. And this right here is the key shift in thinking. What a lot of us might see as just random, chaotic behavior, this analysis says, nope. Look closer. It argues this is all part of an intentional strategy where even chaos isn't chaos, it's actually a form of control. So where does this framework come from? Well, the analysis uses Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power as a kind of lens. An essential idea it pulls from that is this. When a leader just openly breaks the rules everyone else has to follow, it doesn't always hurt them. In fact, it can make them seem even more powerful because it sends a message that they're above the whole system. All right, so let's get into the nuts and bolts. How does this playbook actually work? The analysis argues that the very first battlefield, the most important one, is language. I mean, just look at how language is consistently used. The source points out that when Donald Trump says something like he single-handedly did this or that, the literal accuracy isn't really the point. The underlying message is, I alone matter. It's the same when attacking an institution like NATO. It's not just about policy, it's about weakening any shared authority because concentrated power doesn't like to share the stage. And this leads to a really powerful concept the source calls controlled disorientation. Think of it like this. If you just flood the zone with contradictions, with constant noise, people get exhausted. They get confused about what's even real anymore. And in that state of confusion, who do they turn to? Not the most factual person, but the most confident one. This quote from the analysis just nails it, doesn't it? It perfectly sums up that whole strategy. The performance of certainty becomes its own kind of authority, totally separate from whether there's any substance behind it. From there, the analysis points to what it calls an even darker shift, into the language of predators. It argues that when an ally says the country needs to be a predator, it's more than just tough talk. It's openly admitting to a worldview where cooperation is for the weak and pure dominance is what matters. Even something like the offer to buy Greenland gets reframed as a power play, a threat wrapped up in a polite offer. But here's the thing about this constant drive to dominate. According to this analysis, it has a predictable turning point. And this is so crucial because it's the moment a leader's greatest strength, that refusal to accept any limits, flips and becomes their most critical weakness. So the analysis lays out this three-act play for how unchecked power works. First, you have expansion, where power grows by breaking all the rules. Then comes overreach, when the leader starts to believe their own hype and thinks they're invincible. And finally, you get self-cannibalization, because a power that can't be restrained eventually starts to devour itself. And that brings us to the core weakness. The entire myth of the perfect dealmaker, the infallible leader, it's all built on the idea of being invincible. But guess what? Nobody is. And reality, as the source reminds us, always finds a way to intrude. Now, you might be thinking this is all very abstract, right? Just speeches and power moves. But what's so fascinating is how the analysis shows this worldview trickling all the way down into actual domestic policy. This is where the rubber really meets the road. It's about reframing public health not as a public good, but as an economic necessity, and seeing people not as citizens, but as economic units. And all of this brings us to the final and maybe the most critical warning in this whole analysis. It says the ultimate danger isn't some dramatic, sudden collapse. It's a gradual, quiet acceptance of things that were once completely unacceptable. The source identifies this as one of the oldest tricks in the power playbook, exhaustion. You just overwhelm the system. You create so many crises, so much noise, that people become psychologically drained. Outrage just turns into white noise, and trying to resist starts to feel completely pointless. And that's the end game, normalization. The analysis argues the scariest possibility is a world where threats become routine, where predatory language starts to sound, well, honest, and where just staying quiet feels like the safest choice you can make. And this quote just brilliantly drives that whole point home. It's not one big event. It's a slow burn. It erodes everything, step by tiny step, until one day you wake up and the world you're living in is one you wouldn't have recognized before. So in the end, this analysis doesn't give us a neat and tidy answer. Instead, it leaves us with a challenge. It suggests that Donald Trump has been pretty clear about his view of power all along. So the final provocative question it leaves us with isn't about him. It's about everybody else. In this age of just overwhelming noise, is anyone still listening?